important topic, which is coal. So the topic, as you know it and you've read it multiple times, is the future of coal in balancing between energy security and sustainability. Obviously, there are four words that come out of this beautiful title, which is future, coal, energy security, and sustainability. All of these are very crucial in today's discussion when we're talking about energy, right? So coal, as you know it, is crucial for the energy consumption in the world. It provides more than 7% of global energy is actually being sourced from coal. And when we look at it from the Indian context, it's more than 70% of energy security comes straight from coal. So that is a brief on the topic. I will request our chair, Dr. Madhu Pillai, to propound on it further. But just before we get started, to give you a quick brief introduction about sir. Dr. Madhu P. Pillai is the advisor of industry and energy at CPPR. Sir he's been a he's a project management expert with more than 36 years broad-based experience in oil and gas, petrochemical and power industry, specifically under the heads of operation and management. And he's worked in countries like India, Nigeria, the US, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Sir is currently joining us from Saudi Arabia. He's an engineer by his academics, and he's done a PhD in strategic project management. Sir is also a fellow, he's not just an advisor to CPPR, but he's also a fellow in many of the leading organizations like ISEC, CEI, Institution of Engineering, and many others. So over to you, sir. The dialogue is all yours.
Thank you so much, Akansha. And hi, everyone. Good day. Based on which part of the world you are joining this event from. Welcome all of you to yet another dialogue of India Energy Samvad. As you know, it is a dialogue on the global and domestic energy markets and the challenges around it. After two successful dialogues, this is our third attempt in this series. As we had mentioned earlier, the motivation behind this entire series is kind of a timely intervention in navigating through visibly pressing issues of the energy market. As we consistently maintained in our last two dialogues, our focus is not just on environmental aspects. The deliberations will be around a convincingly visible blend of business, geopolitics, global economics, and national policies. Today, we will deliberate on the future of the coal in India in balancing between the energy security and the energy sustainability of the country. We will also endeavor to map it out to the global scenarios too. So for doing it, we have three renowned panelists with enviably outstanding profiles in their respective domains. While we have two experts in this field from two most reputed organizations within India, we also have an international expert who will bring in a global perspective and help us in mapping it out into the Indian scenarios. Quickly touching on the three panelists we have. The first is Dr. Anand B. Rao, who is the Institute Chair, Professor and Head, the Center for Technology Alternatives for the Rural Areas of IIT Mumbai. Then we have Mr. Balasubramanian Vishwanathan, Energy Policy Advisor at the International Institute of Sustainable Development. And we have Mr. Toby Lockwood, the Director, Technology and Market for the Carbon Capture Europe. Honestly, I couldn't ask for more, though we did want one or two female panelists as well. Unfortunately, we couldn't get someone matching these profiles within the time frame. But we would be having more diverse panel going forward. Now, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you so very much. Now, coming to today's topic, the future of coal in India is kind of shrouded in uncertainty. We all know that, as Akansha quickly touched in the intro. While on one hand, India has committed to reducing the carbon intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030. not an easy target. On the other, the union government has undertaken the task of producing 1.2 billion tons of coal in the country by 2023-24. It sounds a bit confusing, isn't it? It obviously raises serious concerns regarding the feasibility of the first target, which is reducing the carbon intensity of the GDP by 45% by 2030. See, one of the foremost elements that has caused the use of coal to be debated almost perpetually is a dichotomy that surrounds this resource. While on one hand, it is responsible for an overwhelming quantum of global GHG emissions, equally on the other hand, the coal continues to be one of the most affordable and also accessible sources of energy across numerous nations, not only India, and making it pretty indispensable to the energy security of these countries. Obviously, India too. However, the global push for the renewable energy in the wake of worsening climate changes has thrown the future of coal into uncertainty, especially with increasing pressure on the nations to phase out this resource, phase out this easily accessible and affordable resource. Then now you can understand the challenge around it. With nearly 74% of the total power generated in India in 2022 coming from coal alone, I would say it is beyond vital that the future of this crucial resource in this country be debated thoroughly, to critically examine what the oncoming years hold for coal in India, the various methods that will need to be employed to make coal-based power sustainable, and the role coal will play in the wake of increasing energy generating capacity from renewable sources. Because renewable sources is again yet another reality the world is very fast marching into. Now, we at CPPR has taken it very, very seriously as a topic to be deliberated and to some extent researched as well. As a conscious, we felt this topic is very, very relevant today, because there is a very, very highly mounting pressure on India and also on other nations that make use of coal on a large scale to gradually phase out this resource in order to accelerate the global climatic goals. We all can understand it, beyond doubt. However, in defiance of such a rampant pressure, as I mentioned earlier, India, at least India, has set for itself a very tall target of producing 1.2 billion tons of coal by 2023-24, this a year ahead, just an year ahead. Moreover, the future of coal in India remains mired in uncertainty as a result of continually increasing generation capacity from renewable sources. And this, of course, raises questions on the role that coal is touted to play in the future. In our today's discussion, we will attempt at a garnering informed answers to such questions, which basically have assumed very, very increasing relevance in today's time. Though the topics and the questions would be pretty diverse, we will broadly just touch on few key areas like the feasibility of the life with or without coal. It's easy to say that we need to phase out coal, but how difficult is it to practice it? And at what price and what benefit? And we will also touch the closure of many old coal power plants, which are highly inefficient. And when it comes to even production of energy and even for contributing to the carbon. Then we will also quickly touch upon meeting the market requirements of coal in a very timely manner. And finally, we will also touch upon the sustainable use of coal in the coming years or decades. Now, I've kind of touched the topic and the objective and the pattern or the direction this dialogue is going to be kind of navigated through. Now, let me quickly introduce our eminent speakers as well. Let me just start with Dr. Anand Rao, who is an institute chair, professor, and the current head at the Center for Technology Alternatives for Rural Areas at the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Mumbai. He's also associated with the interdisciplinary program in climate studies and the Ashok Desai Center for the Policy Studies in same institution. He holds a PhD from the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh in US. And interestingly, his research was fully sponsored by the US Department of Energy. He holds his undergrad and master's from IIT Mumbai. I would say he has gone back to his alma mater as a faculty. I would rather say a very renowned faculty. So I don't know what he would be enjoying more as a faculty of that institution or an alma mater of this institution. He must be remembering every old interesting days in the campus. Let me touch his areas of research interest, which include energy and environment, technology assessment, climate change mitigation, carbon capture and sequestration, energy policy and planning, rural energy consumption, and rural livelihoods. I think the list keeps going. Welcome, Dr. Anas Rao.
Namaskar.
And now let me move to our second speaker, Mr. Balasubramanian Vishwanathan, who is an energy policy advisor at the prestigious International Institute for Sustainable Development. He primarily engages in data collection and analysis, stakeholder consultations, policy review, project management, and communication on issues related to energy and climate. He is based in New Delhi. Bala holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the prestigious BITS, Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani. And he has a master's degree in sustainable energy engineering from the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. His recent works include tracking government subsidies and the role of state-owned enterprises in changing energy landscape. Welcome, Mr. Balasubramanian Vishwanathan. Now let me move to Mr. Toby Lockwood, who is the Director of Technology and Market for the Carbon Capture Europe for the Clean Air Task Force. In his current role, he leads CATF's analytical work to highlight the role of carbon capture in helping Europe to meet its climate goals. Prior to joining CATF, Toby worked on the carbon capture for 9 years with IEA, Clean Coal Center, where his projects included in-depth studies into decarbonization of coal power plants in China and India, interestingly. He writes regularly on CCS and other energy sector issues for industry publications. Toby has his master's degree in chemistry and materials from the University of Cambridge, the prestigious Imperial College London, and the McGill University. Welcome, Mr. Toby Lockwood.
Thank you.
And just a request to my panelists, can we all use our first name? It will make the dialogue a bit more easier for me. I would say it will, I don't know, it would make it formally informal or informally formal. If you all appreciate, let's go with our first names. Now,
Sure.
with the further ado, let's straight away walk into the dialogue. Now, we have split this dialogue in 2-3 compartments. First, we will have some very generic points discussed with all the speakers. And then we will have specific points discussed with individual speaker based on his area of expertise and interest. And of course, the connectivity to the topic we are covering today. And after that, each of the speakers will have probably 5 to 6 minutes slot for them to touch generally upon the overall topic, not connected with any specific question or point. And the whole discussion or dialogue will be concluded by a Q&A session at the end. So if you're all good to go, which I assume, let me start with something generic with you, Anand. Pretty specific to India. What kind of a future do you see for coal in India and globally by 2050? By 2050. Do you think coal will continue to be pertinent for the energy security of numerous nations, obviously including India? What do you see as a landscape, a broad landscape by 2050? If you can please share your thoughts on this.
Namaskar. Thanks, Madhu, for the introduction. I hope I'm audible.
You are, sir.
Yeah. So I wish I had a crystal ball to tell what will happen in 2050. But looking at the trends and then the kind of importance of coal in the current energy infrastructure in India, it is the backbone of our energy infrastructure for no doubt. And even though we are harping on increasing the share of renewables and non-fossil share of energy infrastructure in future, and we have commitment towards the same, I feel coal will continue to play a very key role in the years to come. And although we have now even committed to net zero by 2070, if we are looking at a timeline like 2050, no doubt that coal will continue to be there by 2050. I will claim that it will continue to be there by 2070 also. So that is a short answer to your question. And I don't think India will be one of the countries which will continue to do so. If we look at the overall situation with respect to supply of fossil energy, out of the three, I think coal is the one which is more or less available with majority of the countries around the world. And there is a very concentrated access to gas and oil, but many of the countries have access to some type of coal and some quantity of coal, which is one of the cheapest form of energy as of now. So I believe in the absence of any substantial breakthrough to convert your grid infrastructure completely to renewables, which are highly time dependent and season dependent, coal will continue to be there, playing a key role, especially in the developing part of the world. That's what I feel.
Thank you so much, Anand. Very, very insightful. And it has really set the tone for the dialogue. Now, can I go to Bala now? Bala, do you believe that coal needs to be pushed out for India to meet its climate mitigation targets? Because India aims to achieve 50% installed capacity from renewable energy by 2030. Again, a very, very ambitious target. And 2030 is pretty near. With a large share of the country's installed capacity potentially coming from renewable sources, if we really march seriously towards this ambition, what kind of a role do you envisage for coal-based power plants to be playing in the country, which currently contribute a very, very substantial percentage of the overall electricity generated in the country? If you can please share your thoughts.
Sorry, I was a little distracted with my unmute. I could not unmute myself for a bit. Can you just summarize the question? What was the timeline that you had mentioned?
I can frame the question once again. Absolutely fine.
Yeah.
See, Bala, do you believe that coal needs to be phased out for India to meet its climate mitigation targets? Why this is important is, as a country, we aim to achieve 50% of installed capacity from renewable energy sources by 2030. We all know it's a very, very ambitious target. And 2030 is just very nearby, it's tomorrow. For setting such a massive target, just tomorrow. So with large share of the country's installed capacity potentially coming from renewable sources, if we seriously and religiously march towards this ambition, what kind of a role do you envisage for the coal-based powers playing in the country? Because currently it contributes to 74% of the overall electricity generated in the country. If you can please share your thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you, Madhu. Sorry, just got a little distracted.
No worries. No worries.
This is a very fascinating question. So first of all, thanks to CPPR for having me here. It's a privilege talking with all the esteemed audience here, and it's nice to engage and discuss on this issue. I would actually start my view by taking a slightly contrarian position to what Dr. Anand Rao said, and I think that's the purpose of discussion, right? First of all, we are not in a position to forecast. And again, this is referencing to what Dr. Anand just said. We are only looking at scenarios. So we have a range of scenarios that we estimate, and this is what the International Energy Agency does. This is what India's own CEA does. This is what every civil society who's working on modeling pathways, this is what they do. And we don't look at, we can't forecast, we look at some scenarios. Based on the scenarios, there are a range of conditions that we are looking at. And one of the things which I think makes looking at phase down of coal realistic is the market forces. So while energy security remains a very pertinent consideration, I think India's coal sector in its current form is being driven by the energy security concerns combined with the large vested interests of state-owned enterprises. So these are the two parameters which are dominating the coal sector as a whole. Coal is the largest commodity moved by Indian Railways. Coal India Limited is the single largest coal mining company in the world, with nearly 700 plus million mine capacity, and NTPC single-handedly has 70 gigawatts of thermal power capacity. And all new investments, for the most part, I think I read a report by IEFA, which said that 50% of new thermal capacity, which is under construction, are owned by state-owned enterprises. So these are the two factors which are essentially keeping the coal sector going. What I believe is that the market forces are going to push and make it's going to drive coal for a dramatic phase down at some point. I believe that it is not 2030, I believe it's not 2030, but 2030 onwards is the point where we see tipping changes. I also believe in the principle of exponential growths, and every one of us in this call are accustomed to the scale at which exponential changes happen. That is how we tracked COVID, for example, where the cases went up doubling every day. So over a span of week, what we saw in 2 weeks back and what we are seeing at that particular day was completely different. Such change is very established in all forms of business. It happened to BSNL, for example, when the whole 4G network came out. It has happened to video streaming platforms. It can happen in the electric vehicle business, for example, in Norway. Likewise, in India, solar power is one of those technology options which has a tremendous potential for growth. However, where this differs, and where I believe the big bottleneck or uncertainty in the scenarios come from, is the financing. I believe the biggest question mark and the range of uncertainty that is going to come looking ahead into 2030 and beyond is, can we get the financing and the scale of investments into renewables, which will sufficiently cover the demand growth that is coming naturally. Coal inherently, I do not believe as a technology is going to become cheaper by any forms. Coal price by CIL itself has not changed in 4 years. Any new coal, when they go through a power purchase agreement or when any bids come out, they are not cheaper. They are 4 to 5 rupees on average compared to 2 rupees for new solar technology. So I believe phase down is very much on the cards. That said, since there is a potential for it to be a dramatic change, like how exponential change works, there are several key considerations which from a governance standpoint is very important in terms of the number of people, the communities who are involved, what is the vested interest, the risks to investors. For example, just take CIL, which is the largest coal mining company in the world. Their largest shareholder outside of the government of India is Life Insurance Corporation. So India's entire financial system is tied to the coal sector. So the energy security aspect also extends to financial security, I would say. So all these are the factors which are going to create uncertainties going ahead. But I think in principally, India as a market is well positioned to look at phasing down coal. And I do not believe that this is a discussion we should shy away from. This would be my remarks on this particular situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bala. I think this is how and why these deliberations are very, very valuable for taking the general perceptions of the people who are related or rather interested in these areas. Thank you so much for those insights. Now, let me go to Toby. I just basically want to map out the national perspectives which Anand and Bala have touched to the international perspective, which Toby will bring in. And as I mentioned earlier, Toby did have major interests, research interests in the areas of coal in China and India. Toby, how do you foresee the journey of transitioning away from coal as an energy source, nationally as well as globally? In your opinion, what would be the key things we need to be mindful of, when we are discussing this transition away from the coal, especially with ever-growing energy demands and needs? Because we need to understand and accept that the energy needs and demands are growing exponentially high, unbelievably high, beyond any prediction. So how do we connect these things in a global platform and possibly in an Indian context or any other specific country's context?
Yep, thank you, Madhu, and thanks for inviting me to join this webinar. Really interesting discussion. I think it's clear that India is in a particularly challenging position when it comes to phasing out coal, but with the ambition of reaching net zero in 2050, it's clear that the energy system will have to change beyond recognition in that time, and coal will have to play a diminishing role. But at the same time, that phase out process is much more challenging than the process that has been started perhaps earlier in the US and European countries, because many of those countries have had, particularly the US, have had the option to switch to gas. In Europe, that's covered a cost. In the US, that's actually been economically easier due to the abundance of gas. So, and also those countries are not experiencing the increase in energy demand that we see in India. I mean, energy consumption per capita in India is, I think, the order of 10% of some of those countries, more developed countries. So it's very challenging to phase out, to rapidly phase out this particularly pivotal source of energy in a country with growing energy demand, and without access to alternative fuels such as gas. So a lot of challenges, and I think the position of Clean Air Task Force would be to highlight that there are risks to trying to achieve this energy transition, and we need to prepare for all eventualities and explore many technologies which can get us to net zero. So it's important to try and achieve our India's renewable phase out goals, which are very ambitious. But at the same time, we need to be doing other things. India needs to be doing other things, and other countries need to be doing other things. And I mean, this is a challenge even for the Western European countries and North American countries. I've described, even there, it's a challenge to completely phase out thermal power generation in the timescale required. So I think India needs to be mindful of those challenges. And India obviously is mindful of those challenges. What can we learn from those countries? I think just to speak to some of the points made by the previous speaker, coal power generation can appear to become economically less favorable under current market dynamics and the impressive reductions we've seen in renewable power generation, but that costing doesn't really take into account the value which was alluded to by the first speaker in terms of providing dispatchable energy to the grid. So I think energy markets need to recognize that value more going forward, and that's the trajectory that's been taken in Western Europe and America. to really begin to look more carefully at how we can value the different, not just energy, but different attributes of energy in the power, in different attributes of different forms of power generation in the power market going forward. And I guess I'll stop with that thought. So yeah, I think the challenge is great. The cost doesn't tell the whole story, and we need to deploy a large range of technologies to accelerate that transition.
Thank you, Toby. Can you just add one more small part to my question based on what you were telling? Can you also share some insights, if you can, on what are the few hits and misses in our decisions and then policies and actions around the coal sustainability and energy security? Again, in a national and global perspective, or any one of the perspective, whichever you're comfortable with.
Hits and misses in the future, or from past experience?
Either.
I mean, I can speak
experience would be more helpful for us to understand in a robust way, but connecting to future would be valuable. Understood.
I mean, I think speaking from my expertise in carbon capture storage deployment, it's clear that the journey to deploying this technology more widely has been very rocky and had a lot of false starts. So I think it's led to a perception that the technology perhaps doesn't work, or it can't play a role in this transition. But I think that the lesson really to be learned from that that history of the technology is that it has worked. We've had enough large-scale technology demonstrations to show that the technology does work, but B, that we need to completely rethink how to incentivize that kind of CO2 abatement technology. It's not as easy as deploying renewables, and perhaps the political will to do so hasn't been nearly as high as it has been for deploying renewables. So it's really about finding a solution to that double problem of the kind of a level of political and public distaste, which has really led to insufficient political will, and also the fact that it is more challenging. There are high upfront costs. It requires a lot of coordination between different industry actors, the oil and gas sector, the power generation sector, industry, all need to come together to develop something that might look like a CO2 storage infrastructure. But I mean, I'm perhaps getting ahead of the discussion a bit here, but I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the mistakes of CCS deployment in Europe and America, and that's something which perhaps countries like India don't need to go through.
Sure, I couldn't agree more. And now I think having tabled the topic with the general perspectives from our expert panel member. So before we go on to the specific areas to individual speakers' expertise, does anyone of you want to bounce upon something which the speaker said? Then probably we would be more than happy to have that now. Then we will move on to the next session, if anybody wants.
I had a very quick question just to clarify on what Toby, you were saying. So when you had mentioned the incentives for carbon capture, were you referring to carbon taxes and pricing carbon more accurately so that CCUS overall ends up as a technology being more viable?
I mean, that's one way of doing it. I think it's challenging to really push a technology through the early stages of demonstration based on carbon taxes alone. But it is, I think we recognize that in the early stages of deployment of any technology, and we saw that in renewables, particularly in things like offshore wind in Europe, that in the early stages, that deployment required large state subsidies, and then the costs come down, and hopefully at that point you can be driven by in the case of offshore wind power market and carbon pricing alone. But yeah, there's a number of different incentives in the US. They recently raised the value of this tax credit, which is essentially a subsidy to companies storing CO2. In Europe, there is more reliance on carbon pricing as more of a kind of stick mechanism. It costs more to emit than it does to abate, but we still see a role for some subsidies, particularly for infrastructure in the first instance, things like storage sites, CO2 pipelines, to help kind of bridge the cost gap. But in theory, yeah, you could have, if you had a high enough carbon price, then some industries and power generators would choose to not to emit, choose to store.
Good.
I think I just to finish, I think a carbon pricing approach would probably be less applicable in India, to bring it. That's the context of this discussion. I think, yeah, that's not really something we've explored as a likely option for deploying this technology in India.
Can we move on to points more closer to the areas of expertise now? Okay, let me start with again, Anand. Anand, could you please explain the audience what carbon capture technologies are and their role in curbing the emissions from coal-based power? Because this is a very broad subject and many people get confused. So if you can just kind of encompass at a high level for the benefit of the audience, that would be very, very valuable.
I'll go to start. CDR, that is carbon dioxide removal, is a general term nowadays being used, but then it encompasses various set of technologies. Some of them, in fact, propose to capture CO2 from directly from air, direct air capture, using some physico-chemical separation. There are other set of technologies which are mostly biological in nature, where we try to do photosynthesis-based fixation of carbon, which is a more permanent and more logical, benign form of sequestration, I would suppose. There is a distinct set of options which are being portrayed as bridging technology. This is called carbon capture and sequestration. Nowadays, we also include utilization as part of the portfolio. So CCUS is a general term that is being used, where we propose to capture CO2 from the flue gas after that is generated when we use fossil fuels. And then the beauty of this option is that since we are all addicted to consuming fossil fuels, our lifestyle is dependent on use of fossil fuels. We can continue to use fossil fuels, but feel less guilty because we are not going to allow that CO2 to enter into atmosphere and drive the greenhouse gas effect, which is causing climate change. So, substantial portion of this CO2, which would have otherwise gone to atmosphere, it can be captured through physico-chemical separation process. Now, it depends on what fuel we are talking about. We are here talking about coal, but it can be applicable to natural gas, oil as well. And then the key question is, at what scale we can do it? Are we going to go after every automobile which is emitting CO2? Probably it is a bit unfeasible. We are doing it for criteria air pollutants. Like, for example, we do have catalytic converters to control emissions of NOx from all the vehicles on road. But it is not being imagined that way for CO2 at the moment. We can target only the point sources of CO2, and then the coal-based power plants happen to be the most logical targets. There can be other energy-intensive industries like steel and glass and few others, refineries, for example, where we can spot a chimney which is emitting large amount of CO2 at one point. So if we can identify such location where we can do this carbon capture, of course, the next question is, what do we do with all that CO2?
So typical coal power plant in its composition of the flue gas has about 10 to 15% CO2. So far, we have regulations mostly to control pollutants like SOx and NOx and particulates, which are very minute part of this flue gas. So when we are talking about capturing 15% or 12% of CO2 from a coal-based power generation, we have to think about what we are all going to do with all that quantum of CO2. So a typical, say, 500 megawatt coal unit, coal-based power plant unit, may generate millions of tons of CO2 every year. So now the question is, what do we do with it? There is no ready solution in terms of utilizing that large quantity of CO2 right away. The closest application that we have is in fact, ironically, in the, again, fossil fuel industry itself, in the oil industry, that is called enhanced oil recovery operation, where we can use this liquefied CO2 as a solvent, which will help us to extract the remaining tidbits of oil from the oil well. It can be also used for an operation called enhanced coal bed methane recovery, where we can try to store it in deep coal seams, where we can try to extract some methane in exchange. So both these activities have some economic return, whereby part of that CO2 can be immobilized in these locations. So there is some efficacy related issue in terms of how far they can be used for CO2 storage options. But then the other obvious option that is being talked about in terms of storing all that CO2 is underground geological sequestration sites. So for example, they can be depleted oil and gas wells, or more promising are saline aquifers deep underground, where all this CO2 can ultimately dissolve in this saline water body and become mineralized with rest of the geological strata. So that can be a more permanent sequestration of CO2, but this has to be monitored for decades to come. It has to be under pressure for all this time. So there is a huge liability that we are creating for future generations when we are committing to capture this CO2, transport it to a suitable site, store it underground, and continue to monitor it so that we ensure that all that CO2 remains underground and does not come back to atmosphere at all. Just to caution you, in this process is not cheap. Separating out CO2 from the flue gas is a very energy intensive operation. That means when we do that, we may end up consuming more of that coal or more of fossil fuel to offset whatever energy penalty that this process has incurred. We need to pressurize all that CO2 for the long distance transport of that CO2 and ultimately hold it under pressure for so many decades to come. So for all this, it may, on one hand, it may look like we are avoiding CO2 emissions to atmosphere. However, the counter side is it may enhance the rate of fossil fuel consumption to continue to have the net production of electricity at the same level in spite of doing this. So this is in nutshell what we call as carbon capture and sequestration. And if you look at any future energy scenarios in terms of energy mixes, and especially what we are talking about is what are the mitigation measures for climate change. If you look at the current business as usual scenario and whatever is required to achieve our desirable target of 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 degrees centigrade, depending on our position. So the gap between these two scenarios in terms of emissions, part of it is being portrayed to be filled by increased deployment of renewables and energy efficiency, but a significant portion is hoped to be filled by deployment of these carbon capture technologies. And that is the hope that in future we'll be able to achieve either the net zero targets or any kind of substantial carbon mitigation only through the deployment of this silver bullet, that is carbon capture and sequestration.
That was beautiful. That was really beautiful. You know, see, as we all know, the technology is evolving, I would say, in today's world every second. At least I personally, sincerely hope some very interesting and innovative disruption happens in this world, which can enhance this technology to such a level which makes it more economical and finds much more practical applications for the stored CO2. Now, but can I also connect another thing with you? We were just going through, my team in CPPR was going through a paper you had published, in which you used the Indian energy security scenarios building tool. You came to a conclusion that India might not need CCS, that is the carbon capture storage technology, to reduce the emissions intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35%, as outlined in the intended nationally determined contributions. On this basis of the development that have occurred since then you did it in 2017, your paper was in 2017, and we are 5 years or 6 years ahead of that. Are you of the same opinion today, or do you believe CCS technology might have a greater role to play even before 2030?
See, we are already speaking in 2023.
Correct.
Yeah, and you're talking about 2030, which is just 7 years away from this. I started my work in CCS area in 1999. There were lots of announcements of CCS projects around that time. We had the famous FutureGen project that US had announced, 1,000 megawatt coal plant with carbon capture. And many of these plants could not come up on ground because there are practical difficulties in terms of scaling up of this technology, and more importantly, the economics. And further important is in terms of the legalities and regulatory aspects. As I mentioned, effectively, we are going to create a large liability for future in terms of what will happen to all that CO2 that we are storing underground, and whether it is the most logical way to tackle the climate change problem in the first place. So what happens if there is accidental leakage of this CO2 from these places? So, so there are lots of issues that need to be tackled before this technology can make a significant dent in terms of carbon mitigation that we are all desiring of. And I have a strong belief that the developed countries, which are even in a dire situation to implement carbon mitigation measures to in tune with their commitments to solve this problem, they should be the first ones to demonstrate the safe deployment of this technology, whereby afterwards maybe developing countries can follow the suit, because there is a huge funding requirement to implement this technology. I just, if we want to implement carbon capture on a typical coal plant, the investment of the coal plant itself may double, and the cost of electricity being generated from that plant also may become double. In a country like India, where our coal plants are already facing a lot of logistics issues, maybe it is availability of good quality coal, the efficiencies are low, there are problems in terms of logistics for coal reaching to them through railway network, scarcity of water in the summer for cooling towers. So there are a number of issues, both in terms of the efficiency, that is on performance side. We want to make sure that electricity is affordable to large masses. Many of our rural areas are just getting electrified or still not operational in terms of having access to electricity. And if we are going to increase the cost of production or generation of electricity because we are worried about carbon mitigation from coal plants, I don't think that will sell in terms of the public acceptance in country like India. So it can be taken up on a pilot scale, but even for that, maybe it will require like a 3-4 years time, because now there is some ground interest. Some oil companies are coming on board, NTPC is showing interest. So some activity in the CCS space may begin, but to have any meaningful deployment of CCS in India, especially, it is beyond my imagination that 2030 is any kind of a timeline for that. In fact, that's why I said even 2040 or 2050, we'll have to watch and see what happens internationally and whether we get any kind of a funding support to even try it out in our own land.
That's clear and well put together. Okay, now, Bala, can I just come to you? Because again, this is these questions are or points are more relevant to your areas of interest and research. You know, we were going through again your papers and other things. Now, you had co-authored a report titled Mapping India's Energy Policy 2020. Very, very interesting report. And it was basically an attempt to collect and analyze the data on support by the Indian government for the fossil fuels, as well as the clean energy from 2014 to 2022, about 8 to 9 years span. Could you share with us some very pertinent findings connected to the governmental support? There's a governmental support for coal over all these years, and what bearing they have on the future of coal in the country. If you can please throw some lights on that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And to contextualize, I mean, Madhu has already referenced the study, but we released the latest version of this report in December 2022. It's called Mapping India's Energy Policies 2022 December update. And the purpose of the study and broadly the research area is to look at government support through three aspects. Of course, there is the direct form of government support, which is through subsidies. To illustrate a very famous form of government subsidies would be something like the LPG subsidies that we've received for several years through the direct benefit transfer scheme and so on and so forth. That's a directly form of government subsidies. The second form of government support, which we believe is quite pertinent, is the investments made by state-owned enterprises. So government are majority owners of several energy enterprises in India. There are 7 large enterprises within the energy sector, and actually 10 of the top 10 Maharatnas are from the energy sector, which is CIL, ONGC, IOCL, BPCL, HPCL, GAIL, and NTPC. So that's the second form, and the third is the investments made by public financing institutions. I'm talking LICs, PFCs, RECs, so on and so forth. So these three form the 3 pillars of government support, and the study looked into it. What we came up with, and these are high-level estimates based on what can be publicly accessible. And of course, the methodology is subject to various caveats and depending on how you understand it. In all, our sense is the government support was to the tune of 4 lakh crores across the board, across all 3 categories. Within that, the subsidies component came to around 2.1 lakh crore. And within 2.1 lakh crore, the biggest, by far the biggest form of government support is to electricity sector. Subsidies made for end users, predominantly within residential and agricultural consumer categories, which was to the tune of 1.3 to 1.4 lakh crores, and so on and so forth. Then it sort of keeps dropping. Within this particular form of government subsidies itself, coal subsidies was relatively small, and I believe that India's coal subsidies have remains stagnant over the years. There have not been tremendous increments in government support through subsidies. For example, there's not been any bailouts or waivers or tax breaks and so on and so forth. In fact, coal is taxed, and coal is taxed in the form of GST compensation, says in terms of royalties and so on and so forth. Where the coal sector receives support is 2 or 3 forms. The first form of support that the coal sector receives is through notified pricing. So CIL dominates the coal consumption supply chain in India. They are responsible for what I think 70 to 80% of domestic power generation, and they set the price. This is not a market mechanism. They have an agreement. They notify a price and it gets approved, and that's basically what goes out. There are about 14 grades and so on. So CIL's notified price is to the tune of 2,000 rupees or so, but I mean it varies. Like so, when you add all the other components, but it is. My point is, it's significantly lower than international prices. Of course, it's not an apples to apples comparison because the quality of coal domestically produced is significantly different from imported coal. But the fact remains that CIL controls the prices, which acts as a form of support in the sense it is keeping the prices fairly low. And this is amplified by the fact that the prices have not changed in 4 years. The second form of government support to the coal sector, which is important, is through regulations or law which are not being implemented. There are 2 which come to mind. The first is the mandate to meet air quality standards. If people are aware of the policy scenarios, I think in 2015 or 2016, there was an announcement made that all thermal power plants in India should cap their SOx, NOx, and particulate matter emissions. And this was set at that point a fairly and kind of really ambitious target of 5 years or so, but it's been pushed back twice. So there has been consistent non-compliance of air quality standards. And to meet these air quality standards, we estimated, I believe I am giving ballpark figures here, but the total cost to the sector to the tune of 70,000 crores to 1 lakh, just installing the pollution control technology. Of course, this would result in a cost pass through to the consumer, which in turn makes the end electricity prices high. But that is one form of government support. The other form of government support was there was a coal washing mandate put in place to reduce the sort of local pollution, and this was revoked during COVID. So while there has not been a form of subsidy support itself, there has been support in the form of regulation and pricing. The other more innocuous form of support is through this giant quantum, which I said is the electricity subsidies. Remember that electricity subsidies account for over 50% of total estimated subsidies from a data set. And since 70% of power in India is coming from the coal sector, indirectly, that is where the form of support is propping up the sector. To give an illustration of how it happens, if you tax coal and you increase the price of power generation for whatever purpose, but the cost is not truly passed through to the consumer and it gets accumulated in the DISCOM, and the distribution company either supports by or the state government supports by providing subsidies, or DISCOMs just absorb it as losses, which gets eaten up through schemes and years and decades of sort of inefficient DISCOM practices. That is where so you tax it and it just gets accumulated there. So, and then the end use and electricity pricing is not sort of being reflective of the increments. What that means is any further forms of additional costs to the coal sector is likely to make the energy system and electricity pricing in the country more vulnerable. This brings me to the point of cost economics of coal within the context in India makes the coal sector as a whole difficult as a choice going ahead. And this is where market forces and so on. This alludes to my opening part. But in short, yeah, this is how I would contextualize how government supports the coal sector in India.
Thank you so much. In fact, one of the key aspects I liked was the way you connected the subsidies versus the regulatory relaxations government has offered from time to time, especially during the COVID time. So it amounts to cost. It amounts to cost. Anyway, now that's good. That's a very good perspective. Thank you so very much for that. Now, Toby, can you help us to share some thoughts from your research and publication? You had co-authored a document, a pathway to reducing emissions from coal power in India specifically. I'm very delighted about the interest you have taken in this sector in India, working from Europe. Could you please share some key insights regarding the various methods that can be applied for reducing emissions from coal-fired power in India?
Yep, thank you. That study was done in 2020 for the Coal Industry Advisory Board to the International Energy Agency, obviously based, well, it's an international organization, perhaps based in some sense in Paris, but the interest, the relevance of a country like India to the global coal sector is, of course, enormous. So that was the impetus behind that study, and it covers a number of topics, not just CO2, but air quality issues and the deployment of things like NOx and SOx controls. I worked primarily on the issue of the potential to deploy carbon capture and storage. And what we did in that study is really look at what data there is for geological sequestration potential. So as was described by Professor Rao, there are certain types of rock which are suitable for putting CO2 underground. Just to come back to the point about permanency and future liability, I think it's important to emphasize that the IPCC report on carbon capture and storage has said that in an appropriate appropriately selected geology, there's extremely low likelihood of CO2 leakage from these formations. They said that the fraction retained in appropriate selected reservoirs is very likely to exceed 99% over 100 years and is likely to exceed 99% over 1,000 years. I mean, on this time scale, it's extremely beneficial to the climate, even if you did have that any of that kind of leakage in a worst case. Because the problem we have now is CO2 in the atmosphere now. So I'd like to emphasize that. But what we did as part of this study was to look at how the existing coal plant locations correspond to suitable geological storage. But it's important to note that and we also explored potential incentives and policy mechanisms for how, based on international experience, for how the deployment of carbon capture and storage might be incentivized. And, you know, as been outlined, is extremely by Bala, is extremely challenging in India when you have power generating companies that are already challenged to make make a profit, and the operating hours of these coal plants is only going to reduce as renewable energy is deployed. So a lot of challenges which I can get to, but within the context of this study, we really tried to highlight some key areas for development, and that's what's happening in Europe and other countries as well that are looking seriously at CCS. The first step is, of course, to identify good potential areas for CO2 storage and try and match that with areas of high emissions where you might be able to develop some what would be called a cluster of CO2 capture, where lots of emitters, lots of large emitters can share infrastructure and thereby achieve some economy of scale and perhaps address the cost issue, which was also raised by Dr. Rao. So I think a couple of things I'd like to stress. Firstly, the issue of CO2 permanence, the permanence of CO2 storage, which I already mentioned. I think it's difficult for most people to comprehend. People don't have an instinctive understanding of the subsurface of underground, but these are formations which have held oil and gas, and in many cases CO2 even for millions of years. So it's possible to reverse that process and put the CO2 back. When you talk about future liability, the liability of that CO2 leakage, where we also have a liability to future generations to consider of the putting CO2 in the atmosphere. It's better than putting in the atmosphere. The real legacy we're leaving future generations at the moment is that of climate change. And I think it is difficult to imagine a lot of CCS deployment in India by 2030. I agree with that, but it's also difficult to imagine 500 gigawatts of renewables. We need to make these bold ambitions, and I think it will require a lot of international help. I think it's possible to do, in that time frame, it should be possible to make a good start, I think, and have some significant demonstration projects. And if we recognize, maybe we can't predict the future. We could have nuclear fusion or all kinds of wonderful technological advances to do away with the need for CCS, but doing the numbers at the moment, it looks like it'll probably be necessary, and that's what comes out in the numbers from the IPCC and the IEA and other projections for India more than many places because of this current heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So it's something that needs to be tried in a no regrets policy. And I'm talking a lot here, but I think the last thing I would say is the economics of this don't look very good within a current power market framework. But to give the example of the country where I live, which is the United Kingdom, the economics are also challenging for CCS in the power sector. Here we're looking really only at CCS on gas power plants. But from a technical standpoint, there's still been a conclusion that we will need some CCS abated gas power in the grid. So it's become more a question of how you can make the economics work for that. And there's been special contracts developed which compensate these plants for the capacity they're providing. It's really become more about the kind of free power market is over. It's becoming on the renewable side and on the dispatchable power side a question of how you can make contracts which deliver the grid, the zero carbon grid which we need. I think countries like India will also get to that point. It may be a few key coal plants providing that backup close to CO2 storage, but that will need to be supported in some way.
Thank you, Toby. Thanks, indeed. Now, though all of you have got many, many common areas of interest, you also have some very interesting and valuably diverse areas as well. So we thought of having this next session 5 minutes for each of you, but in the interest of the time, we may unfortunately have to cut it a bit down. But may I request you to share your general thoughts on any area related to this topic? Doesn't have to be intimately connected with it, but something valuably generic around this topic and close to your heart. If you want to share, that will be very interesting for the audience. But please let us try to limit each of you probably 3 minutes, if that's okay with you. So if that's fine, can we start with Bala? Bala, are you happy to kick it off?
Sure. Okay, so I have 3 minutes on the clock here. I think, yeah, there are so many aspects to it. But one way I wanted to think about this issue is like a sort of a thought experiment in the form of various stakeholders. Imagine you're now in 23 and you have sort of deep interest in the coal sector for some reason or the other, and there are different types of stakeholders. We often resort to thinking of like a system solution in the sense like this is what as a system we need, when often there are these stakeholders who have their own preferences, which sort of then drives market change. Which is weird for me to talk because I still come from a policy background. But let's start off with a power developer. Or no, you know what? Let's start with a finance investor. So if you're an investor and you already have a very large investment portfolio in fossil fuels, it is becoming more and more difficult to raise capital in the global markets by virtue of a very fossil heavy asset. And this is tied to like the declaration on public finance, the last Glasgow summit, or generally market sentiments driven by ESG or climate consciousness. Investors are generally becoming more climate conscious, which in turn means that raising capital is difficult into fossil fuel projects. So already you're looking at ways to look beyond it. And this is where like the sort of, it becomes harder for coal. The second aspect is, imagine you are a power plant developer. You are already facing cost challenges raising finance because lending is going to become more and likely it's going to start reducing for coal sector. On top of that, you are faced with a plethora of market risks that's associated with the coal sector. It can be such as being forced to import further taxes, which is completely likely because right now India's, if you account for the GST compensation cess, it's like $2 per ton of CO2 emissions. Whereas the recommendations is a tune of 50, 60, and the carbon pricing that's needed to make carbon capture very attractive is probably crossing the 60s, maybe approaching hundreds as well, $100 per ton. Maybe Toby can correct me on that. But essentially, as a power plant developer, you are inclined to bet on renewable energy sector. And this is established by all major renewable players in India. This is what all Tata, Reliance, Adani, until they ran into all their problems recently, JSW, Mittal, all major power sector developers are looking at diversification and moving out. Then you have government. I believe government has the most challenging task in terms of looking at energy transition, because they are faced with two problems which is associated with the with coal sector not being, or like facing down coal sector. First is the energy security problem. Second is the jobs, communities and societies problem. In terms of energy security, I think the best solution is to make manufacture domestically, secure supply chains. This extends to critical minerals, so on and so forth. We recently had the news of lithium being discovered in India, and hopefully that would make the energy security case less dependent on like having to import from China or whatever it may be. The second is in terms of manufacturing. In terms of jobs, domestic manufacturing has a tremendous capability, and this has clearly been in government's priority, the PLI scheme and Atmanirbhar broadly. So that is where government's focus is. So and finally, the fourth actor is the end use customer. So who is going to face the increasing costs associated with poll taxes and so on and so forth, as opposed to renewable energy costs, which have shown a history of declining. My final takeaway is, if we are betting between coal plus CCUS for the long-term future or renewables with round-the-clock storage, my bet right now is renewables and round-the-clock storage as being able to deliver, because that has a better economic prospect and technology prospect compared to coal plus CCUS. I am not denying the need for CCUS. I believe it is going to be pertinent, especially for net zero goals. But the upfront cost should be borne by the developed countries. They have gone too long and they have taken up too much of the carbon budget. So they should be the first people who are spending the initial money, getting the technology costs down before it can be like expected from India. So this would be my high level take, and I believe this is like my personal view going ahead, because you can't predict the future. You only work with scenarios, and I'm basing it on currently available information.
Thank you, Bala. If you all agree, let me now go to the Western world and then come back to India. So Toby, can you be the next person?
Sure. So can you repeat the question? Was it the same question?
No, it's not a question. What we were trying to tell was, if you would love to share something which is too close to your heart, your areas of interest, but which is not very intimately connected, but indirectly at least connected to the topic we are discussing today. Now you want to throw some light on some additional aspects which would be valuable for the audience. And
yeah, sure, absolutely. I feel I did that a little bit already in my last statement, which probably went outside of the question. I think I would agree. I think I'm conscious that we're talking about coal and specifically coal power today, but you know, in Europe and America, there's increasing focus on the role of carbon capture and storage in non-power applications, and that's where it's really difficult. It's particularly difficult to ignore the need, and I'm sure that's what Bala was alluding to as well. Also for potentially achieving negative emissions, it's an option. But yeah, industries like cement are going to need carbon capture. There's no other way to decarbonize them. So if you start from that standpoint, that most countries, certainly India, will need carbon capture and storage in some form, if only to decarbonize those particularly challenging industries, then you've got to start developing that technology in that sector as soon as possible. India has a bit longer with this 2070 target, but that's still emissions going into the atmosphere. So really important to start working on that. The role that coal power is going to play in that, I think, is more debatable, but I don't think we can reduce the equation to a little bit how it's presented by Bala, which is renewables are cheaper. That's what everyone's betting on. I mean, yeah, that is what everyone is betting on, but does that mean that that doesn't necessarily mean that those market forces are going to decarbonize your energy system in the best way or even the most economic way, because achieving round-the-clock storage is easier said than done. I mean, India is a great place for solar, but you don't have solar at night. If you could have it's possible that you can have long periods of high demand with insufficient renewable generation. So you can require, our modeling has shown you can require very significant contribution of what we'd call clean dispatchable or clean firm power, which could be a nuclear power plant, it could be a coal plant with CCS. In a country like India, where there's a lot of very recent coal assets, it seems likely that coal power with CCS will play a role in delivering some of that clean firm capacity. And also, it can help stimulate the deployment of CCS in other sectors like CCS, because they're large sources of CO2, which can provide economies of scale for CO2 infrastructure, and that's as a kind of anchor point to a CO2 cluster. So I think it's important that India starts thinking about this and really, it's really important that India starts thinking about this, and it's clear that the government already has. I mean, there was a report from Niti Aayog out very recently, which kind of supersedes the work I did in this in 2020, and already started mapping where CCS could be and what kind of incentives could be used. So it's good to see.
It was a good capping, very interesting, and thank you, Toby. Now, can we get some perspectives from Anand as well, some independent thoughts which are connected to our topic of today?
Yeah, so it's a tough task. You're asking us to talk about.
I thought it's an easy thing.
Topic which is close to our heart, but in 3 minutes, which is really tough.
All right.
So please stop me if I go overboard. So just two, three considerations I would like to put forth. I mean, coming from Sitara, where I especially look at, so this is a Center for Technology Alternatives for Rural Areas. So our focus is on rural areas. And we do a lot of field work in rural areas. We try to understand what is the energy situation in rural areas. So when we are talking about the need for mitigation, technologies like CCS, what is the relevance of all this in the Indian context? So we are facing India, which is now we claim to be 100% electrified, but the situation is quite grim when we go to rural areas. There is a huge disparity in terms of the level of energy consumption in the lowest strata of the society and then those who are the higher deciles. Urban versus rural, metro versus tribal area, there is a huge gap. Many of the rural households which have got the connection, but there is no availability of electricity. There are load shedding hours. So the 24/7 electricity for all is still a kind of a distant dream. So in all that backdrop, I think we need electrons from whatever sources that we can provide. So although we are committed to have a huge ambitious target of renewable deployment in India, but still that's why I came with this earlier statement that we cannot deny the role of coal to be continue to help us in achieving this unmet demand that we have. And there is a huge quantum that we need to provide actually, because as the villages become electrified, the people try to understand what is the utility of electricity, the disposable incomes increase, and then there might be upsurge in terms of the demand for electricity itself. So we are yet to go into that vicious cycle where we'll have to meet that unmet demand, which has been dormant for decades over here. So that is one aspect of it. So the other one that I would just like to mention is that we are talking about electricity, and maybe that will play a major role in various sectors, including transportation, maybe cooking also, because cooking energy is another important hard nut that India needs to tackle. We have now started promoting LPG as a cooking fuel in rural areas, which was not there till recently. On the other hand, we have this commitment that we want to minimize our CO2 emissions and want to become net zero. So we are moving from biomass, which is more or less locally available, to LPG, which is import dependent. At the same time, we are adding emissions to our portfolio. So this is a very tight kind of situation, and I don't know how long we can continue on this kind of a pathway. So we need to introspect, pause, and see how we can bring some coherence in terms of our energy policies related to climate commitment, energy security and affordability of energy sources, which can help us to achieve the SDG 7, where we are committed to provide clean cooking and electricity to our large population base. So that is all. I mean, I would say that these are all important issues, and in that backdrop, we have to see how far coal can play a role or whether it can be phased out at all. So that is the question that we need to deal with.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really, really interesting. I think now, I think we would now take some questions. And before that, let me just thank each of you for being very, very timely and very quickly responding to the online questions online itself. And we thought that may not be practically possible, but thank you so very much for that. So we still have one question which probably we can throw it to all of you, and whoever wants to pick it up can start with, and somebody wants to add to it. Let me read it out. Would a comprehensive transition from fossil fuel to alternate energy be feasible, given our demand size, and how long it would take for India to refine the lithium discovery in Kashmir, the recent one, to aid the energy switch at an actual production level? This is a question from Dr. Abhilash. So any one of you wants to pick, please.
Madhu, I actually jumped the gun a bit. So I actually put in a response in the chat itself. No, but yeah, no, just recently, like just now. But I believe, I mean, I'm just going to quickly summarize what I had written in the rest of the speakers as well. It's very hard to answer, and I believe the biggest challenge is if we had enough time, everything is possible. Of course, we can completely decarbonize over a period of 100 years. We just need to slowly go through it. But that's not the case. We have a time pressure. So we need to pick and choose and sort of go for the best places where we can decarbonization. So from a simple sort of gross simplification, electrification and decarbonization of the electricity sector looks like the best bet. To this extent, I believe that some amount of transport and power sector can be decarbonized with a good, I'm not saying 100% decarbonization, but to a significant amount by 2040. But industries is perhaps going to be more difficult, and that is a challenge for 2040 and beyond. This would be my quick response.
Toby or Anand, do you want to add anything to it or give a different perspective?
Nothing specifically from my end. There is another question here about biomass co-firing. If you allow, I'll just handle that.
Please, very interesting one.
Yeah, so yes, I mean, biomass co-firing has been talked about. Of course, there are again challenges in using biomass as a fuel. The main one comes from the supply chain of biomass. Biomass is a more dilute form of energy, and it exists in various forms. Mainly in India, which is an agricultural-based country, there is agro waste of various sorts. So there is huge potential to make use of this for energy purposes. But then at the moment, I think supply chain of agriculture residue or biomass to coal plants is a major challenge. And again, there has to be fine tuning in terms of the boiler operations when we try to mix coal with this other form of fuel. So these are the challenges. So in terms of the CCS, I think one of the early potential adopters of CCS would be in terms of bioenergy CCS, that is called BECCS. So if we are in dire need of negative emissions, this is the chance that we have, that we can have biomass-based energy generation, and then we capture part of that CO2 and then securely store it or sequester it, which will give us net CO2 emissions that are urgently required to restore the balance. CCS from coal plant is going to give us only about 85% or so avoided CO2 levels. So that means still 15% will be added to the atmosphere. Only bio-based CCS will be the kind of ultimate solution to get negative emissions.
Thank you. I have a question from my side, specifically to Toby. If you could, Toby, if you could please jump that. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has witnessed many countries depending on coal-generated energy more heavily than ever. We all agree. Because that was the only affordable and dispatchable power for this country. And there is little to no doubt that these type of conflicts cannot be dismissed in future as well. Keeping this scenario in mind, what, in your opinion, would be the focus areas around the coal efficiency and sustainability for countries globally? We don't have so much time, but it is a very, very important aspect which I would like to bounce with you.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure I completely answered the question, but I think definitely the conflict has put a renewed emphasis on energy security, which perhaps never went away in India. I think there's been for a while a focus on increasing the energy independence of India by increasing domestic coal production. And I think that's been a story that's kind of gone back and forth for the last for many years. There was a big dash to gas, and then lots of countries, including in Asia, especially realized that that could be a costly pathway if the price of gas increases, and now Europe is experiencing that too. So in Europe, I think we've gone too far to go back to coal. There's been like or rethink the coal phase out policy. There's certainly been a interesting and temporary prolongation of the lifetime of several coal plants in the UK and Germany and other places. But also these are wealthy countries which are able to pay more for gas from, and rapidly build LNG import capabilities in some cases, and get gas from more friendly countries like America. I don't think countries like India necessarily have that such an easy option to do that. And now we're seeing Europe kind of, almost buying up global gas. So yeah, I'm probably going on a little bit too long here, but I think it does kind of emphasize that it's perhaps not a viable pathway to use gas as a bridging fuel away from coal. And I'm not sure that would help much either, because it would involve building a lot of new capacity in the case of India, new fossil capacity. Probably better to look at how we can decarbonize the existing fossil assets, and that's coal.
That's good. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. Now, before we concluding, I think we are just an hour and a half. We just touched the time frame. If I can just quickly, I would not use the word recap, touch some key no takeaways, the way we approach it. We did look at the whole topic in multiple microscopes. I was just going through some notes I've taken. We looked at it on the current scenarios, domestic as well as to some extent, decent extent, international scenarios. And we connected to countries and even global ambitions. The countries means India's ambitions and the global ambitions in sustainability and moving more and more towards the renewable. And we very seriously looked at the commercial aspect, be from a energy producer's point of view or from the consumer's point of view. And we also quickly kind of blended with the policies and the government interventions in this area. So altogether, I really enjoyed this debate. I'm very, very sure the audience and the other speakers also enjoyed it. I would admit that it was not conclusive. It was not expected to be conclusive where the way should be towards exactly where it should be only towards energy security or on sustainability. I think it will take some more time and it will be varying from country to country where the way should be and where it will be within the practical limitations and the resources and the GDPs, and there are multiple aspects around it, around the policies of the government as well. So altogether, I think it was a very decent attempt by CPPR and the panelists and very valuable contributions from the audience as well through their very engaging questions and prompt and I would say almost impromptu answers from the speakers as well. Now, let me also once again thank everyone who put their efforts in getting this organized in the last probably 2.5 months time to bring it from the concept to where we are today. And once again, thank Dr. Anand Rao, Mr. Balasubramanian Vishwanathan, and Mr. Toby Lockwood. Thank you so very much, sir, from each and every one of us in CPPR. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity. Enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting us.